Hello, my name is Mahesh Ramanadham with CDER's Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, Office of Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Assessment. I'm very excited to participate in today's SBIA webinar to talk to you about risk management and application approaches in responding to supply chain constraints during the public health emergency. Now, this talk will heavily focus on post-market submissions for CMC changes, focusing on tools that are available to applicants to proactively and reactively respond to these constraints and making changes to their applications as a result. Now, before we begin, it's important to level set on pharmaceutical quality and what it means to us, especially in CDER OPQ. Now, to us, a quality product of any kind consistently meets the expectations of the user. Drugs are no different. Patients expect safe and effective medicine with every dose that they take. And pharmaceutical quality is about assuring that every dose is safe and effective, free of contamination, free of defects. Quality is what gives our patients the confidence that their next dose of medicine and the dose after that will work consistently and work as intended. During today's talk, I'll spend some time setting the stage on what we have been seeing from a supply chain constraint standpoint. We'll focus in on some of CDER's specific manufacturing and supply chain efforts to help navigate applicants and manufacturers through these constraints, as well as focus on some application tools that help drive proactive and reactive risk management and change management. And then we'll wrap it up with concluding remarks. So what have we seen during the COVID-19 pandemic as far as the impact on drug manufacturing? Well, it should be no surprise that long-existing quality issues are now magnified even more than they were before the pandemic. It's no surprise that before the pandemic, we were all aware of manufacturing problems that led to potential or confirmed drug shortages, whether that's aging facilities, the unavailability of materials, etc. But now during the pandemic, we're seeing that magnify even more, whether that's having clear understanding of who is making what and selling how much of what to whom across the supply chain, vulnerabilities, for example, choke points where one or a few manufacturers, either materials or components or drug products themselves, might be controlling the market, and any vulnerability on their side could lead to access problems for patients, as well as our shortages that continue to persist due to manufacturing and distribution issues. Now, what is interesting, though, is that the magnification has showed us just how deep this goes. Specifically that we're seeing supply chains being constrained at multiple levels during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, our typical flavor is that we've seen and focused on supply chain constraints in what I'll call the normal manufacturing path, or the traditional manufacturing path. So from the chemical entity manufacturers, the testing sites, drug product manufacturers, packagers and distributors, all along that pathway and getting products to patients. What we have been seeing during the pandemic, though, is that even levels below that are now contributing to potential shortages or supply disruptions because of the shared nature of these commodities or resources and their impact on multiple sectors in responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And now with constrained resources, we're seeing it trickle up into drug product manufacturing too. So during the pandemic, we've seen situations where raw materials are now in short supply because they're using across different commodities. Services, for example, companies coming in to calibrate equipment and the unavailability there leading to disruptions in manufacturing. Lack of equipment, even personnel due to absenteeism or things like that where people cannot come into the facility and operate and therefore make products. So we're seeing multiple levels of constraint, which just further magnifies the notion or the concept that the supply chain is vulnerable and we need to be flexible and reactive to this. So as a result, manufacturers of FDA-regulated products need to make changes to meet current product demand or increase supply resilience. And that's across a variety of changes. For example, providing new material sources or qualifying new material sources, bringing on new equipment, bringing on additional manufacturers to build capacity, or even moving production within a network to create capacity at certain strategic locations. So it's important to note here that the concerns around supply chain and vulnerability of the supply chain have elevated even to the point of legislation in the form of the CARES Act. This was enacted back in March 27th, 2020. And specifically, there's a provision in there that requires manufacturers to develop, maintain, and implement redundancy risk management plans that identify and evaluate risks to the supply of drugs. So it should be very clear that it becomes very important now for regulators and industry to be able to look to tools and pathways to mitigate the risk and reduce the risk of vulnerabilities in the supply chain when it comes to providing high-quality medication to patients. So one area that CDER has influence over is the direct engagement with applicants in submitting and managing changes to mitigate the impact of supply chain disruptions to product quality and product availability. Early on in the pandemic, anticipating where we might have certain concerns across our regulatory activities when it came to either applications or the maintenance of products on the market, we set up a couple of different groups, and one of them was focused on manufacturing and supply chain. The goals of this group were to provide clarity to industry on how to make facility and manufacturing changes needed in response to these disruptions, as well as expedite the assessment for application submissions or CMC supplement submissions for drugs that are either in shortage or drugs that are needed for the COVID-19 response, to ensure that we had a continuous supply of medications, of high quality medications, or find ways to increase supply resilience so we could prevent disruptions. Some of our activities have been to provide direct feedback to inquiries from applicants on specific CMC changes or in broader CMC change strategies. And we manage that through direct engagement with applicants through our CDER OPQ inquiries mailbox. We've also been focused on developing and issuing guidance and communication on broader CMC change strategies or CMC change topics that might apply across a number of products. And along the way, very close collaboration with CDER Drug Shortage to ensure that we are prioritizing our resources appropriately. So here we have a couple of highlights as far as those direct goals and engagement areas since the start of the public health emergency. Specifically, we've fielded over 150 inquiries related to CMC changes or change strategies and helping provide guidance or feedback directly to applicants to help navigate these changes, as well as facilitated approval of over 800 CMC supplements for products used in the treatment of patients with COVID-19. So broad impact and very valuable impact when it comes to these two focus areas of the manufacturing supply chain group. Here are a few examples of specific areas we've engaged with applicants and executed changes to provide some color to this initiative. Very early in the pandemic, we engaged with an applicant to help walk through a very wicked disruption to their drug substance supply chain, which necessitated changes to the manufacturing process, the introduction of new starting material sources, and the introduction of new drug substance manufacturing facilities. And through early engagement, we were able to help them identify what studies and data would be needed, how much information we needed to support this change, to file the CMC supplement, as well as reporting categories and strategies to navigate filing in order to resolve this concern quickly and ensure the drug could be restored to the market as soon as possible. A subset example of that was providing feedback on the extent of stability data needed to support a change. Other cases, we have navigated submission strategies or pathways with applicants. For example, in this one case, to qualify a release and stability testing laboratory for dozens of products. So helping an applicant find a way to file one change supplement for many products rather than individual supplements for every single one of those products, and thereby get that change implemented that much quicker. And a final example, providing feedback on the strategy to qualify sterilizing filters and thinking about what kinds of CMC data inclusive of microbiology would be needed to qualify that change, as well as appropriate filing categories based on the level of risk that we were observing the level of risk the applicant was providing to us, as well as our own risk assessment. Now, the important element here is that these engagements were successful because they happened early between the applicant and the FDA, rather than submitting the change and hoping for the best. There was open dialogue and open engagement to help identify risk areas, mitigate those risk areas, and prepare for the change in the submission in the best possible way. Now, a central playbook that has really provided the vision guidance for a lot of our activities during the pandemic in this specific area around manufacturing supply chain has been this COVID-19 question and answers guidance related to manufacturing, supply chain, and drug and biological product inspections during the pandemic. There's a link provided to this guidance document in the resources slide, and you'll see this along the way. Anytime I reference a guidance or a specific document, you'll have a resources slide at the end, which will provide you relevant links. This specific guidance here does a really cool job as far as providing insight into how FDA will approach inspections during the public health emergency, and you'll hear more about that from Lori Graham in the final session of our SBIA webinar today. But the guidance also highlights how applicants can approach CMC changes for facilities and manufacturing processes, inclusive of topics such as risk-based adjustments to the reporting categories, how we would approach expedited assessments and what information would be needed to support that, as well as flexible submission strategies, including the adjustment of submission data requirements, specifically highlighting that FDA is willing to consider a reduction in submission data requirements, considering the totality of the concern, the importance of the product, et cetera. And the guidance also provides references to supporting CMC change guidance documents, which, as you probably know, there are many. So a lot of these are referenced in that Q&A to help bring everything into one spot. Following up on one important concept in the guidance, where we talk about risk-based changes to the reporting category. In our guidance, we introduce this concept that FDA may consider available information and approaches to mitigate the risk of a certain CMC change to support a reporting category for a certain supplement that might otherwise be lower than what would be normally expected for that kind of change. And in order to make that happen, the applicant would need to clearly provide the rationale for that change, supporting information when it comes to product and process knowledge to really help understand the totality of scientific understanding around that change, as well as risk mitigation approaches. And all that information would help us understand whether or not implementing the change could reasonably be justified to have a lower product quality, potential product quality risk, than we would normally expect. Now, that concept is highly aligned with the ICH Q12 principles that talk about ways to streamline change implementation based on scientific knowledge and risk mitigation, whether that's through the use of established conditions or post-approval change management protocols. At the time of the guidance, the Q&A guidance, we did not have ICH Q12 published and available, but we do now. This guidance was published by FDA as an adopted FDA guidance back in May of 2021. So the adoption and implementation of ICH Q12 as an FDA guidance now broadens the utility of this concept using product and process knowledge, scientific understanding, and risk mitigation approaches to modify reporting categories for certain CMC changes. It now broadens that beyond products in scope of the Q&A guidance to all products. So a very important tool there, and something that we'll talk about in the following slides as far as how to utilize these principles to build in proactive and reactive change management and risk management approaches. So here we're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about what are those proactive and reactive application tools that help manage change implementation risk. Now, I've briefly mentioned these across some of the examples earlier, but we're going to do a deeper dive into each one of them over the next couple of slides. And some of these tools currently include our existing risk-based change framework under 31470 and 60112, where the level of risk associated with implementing a change would drive the level of supplement or reporting category, all the way up from the most risky changes under a prior approval supplement down to annual reports that can be reported within the year that that change has been made. This is a very important tool that colors a lot of the framework and possibilities for the tools underneath this line item here. Specifically ICH Q12, having established conditions or identifying established conditions. That risk-based framework under 31470 and 60112 allows us to utilize scientific knowledge and risk mitigation approaches to have that drive the appropriate reporting category based on the specific product understanding and specific change approach question. Other tools include post-approval change management protocols or PACMPs that are also introduced in ICH Q12. In our FDA system, we talk about these as comparability protocols. and as well as a tool that is very well utilized, I would say, on the biotech side, and less so on the small molecule side when we talk about grouped supplements. So finding ways to submit one change filing to represent one CMC change across multiple products. So just a quick further discussion on those regulatory frameworks that we see in 31470 and 60112. Again, these frameworks provide that risk spectrum of change reporting options, as mentioned on the previous slide, but also identifies that we need to report these changes, right? So anything that's changed beyond a condition established in the approved application must be provided for in a supplement or notification to the agency. And what that is, rather those specifics of what need to be changed or reported to the FDA or the application, are further elaborated in change guidances such as changes to an ANDA or changes to an NDA, or SUPAC guidances, etc. So the regulations and guidance previously talked about really establish the foundation, the bare minimum approach for what kinds of changes would need to be reported and at what level when it comes to filing category in the context of our ANDAs, NDAs, and BLAs. Now, a newer tool that was previously adopted in May of 2021 is ICH Q12. Specifically, this guidance is entitled Technical and Regulatory Considerations for Pharmaceutical Product Lifecycle Management. And as stated before, you have a link to this guidance as well as FDA's implementation guidance on the resources slide. That implementation guidance will provide specifics for how to translate ICH Q12 concepts into FDA's regulatory framework so that applicants wishing to utilize concepts in this guidance can do so predictably. Now, what Q12 does is take that foundational framework that's established in 60112 for the BLAs, 31470 for the ANDAs and the NDAs, as well as those change guidances, takes that foundational base framework and provides the opportunity for applicants to further streamline change implementation through science and risk-based tools. And that can be anything from identifying which changes based on our scientific product and process knowledge, which changes actually require a supplement versus those that can be managed solely under the quality system without any reporting to the agency, and opportunities for even those where we will still submit a supplement or a supplement will still be required for that change to come in at a lower reporting category than would otherwise be normally expected. In addition to established conditions, another very important tool in here which gets us to this proactive and reactive risk management approach is the implementation of post-approval change management protocols, which help set up expectations for how to approach a change, get upfront agreement and alignment between the industry and FDA, and then particularly move forward into implementation for those changes. And that can apply for one or many products. Over the next couple of slides, I'll spend some time talking about both of these tools to help you paint the picture how they can be very valuable in situations such as the pandemic, when we are reacting to supply chain constraints, reacting to unknowns, and really need fast change flexibility. So let's do a little deeper dive into one of these ICH Q12 specifically established conditions, or as I'll call them, ECs. ECs, as I mentioned, they offer an opportunity for the applicant to use science, risk-based product and process knowledge to propose modifications to the total number of changes that require a supplement versus those that can be managed just by the pharmaceutical quality system, as well as reduce the risk level and the reporting category associated with a change. And all of that is supported and enabled by utilizing product and process knowledge, enhanced development approaches, and quality risk management principles that we see in ICH Q8, Q9, and Q11. It's also enabled and supported by implementing an effective pharmaceutical quality system, as we see in ICH Q10, that is capable and effective in managing changes in the post-approval phase of the product lifecycle. I like to think of ICH Q12 as the tangible benefit for successfully implementing Q8 through Q11. What do you get when you do the effort to enhance your scientific knowledge, to enhance your product and process understanding? Q12 offers a pathway to make the post-approval lifecycle management activities that much more flexible and much more streamlined when it comes to change implementation. So a little more clarity on what ECs actually are. From a philosophical standpoint, ECs are the legally binding information in an application considered necessary to assure product quality. And that's really driven by not only product and process knowledge and development work, but also scientific assessment conducted by FDA assessors But the practical side of it is, as a consequence, anything that's an EC, a change to that EC will necessitate a submission, whether that's a prior approval supplement, a CPE, notification through an annual report to the FDA. Now, the extent of those ECs, so speaking of how many are there, how narrowly defined are there, are we talking about ranges, are we talking about specific set points? So the extent of those ECs will vary based on a number of factors, which include product and process understanding, the ability to characterize a product and detect product quality, the firm's development approach, so how much understanding was garnered by the development approach, as well as the potential risk to product quality when implementing certain changes. So now, after identifying the established conditions, the applicant has further opportunity to go a step further and propose reporting categories for post-approval changes to those established conditions based on understanding for potential risk associated with the change. Now that there is this additional product and understanding knowledge and this additional understanding of the ability to characterize risk. Now, the approaches could include anything from following the existing regulations and recommendations and guidance. So applicants could say, we're not going to propose specific reporting categories. We'll go with what you have in SUPAC, what you have in the changes through VAN to NDA for specific established conditions, or as I mentioned, propose specific alternate reporting categories which further provide flexibility for implementing changes. Those reporting categories, or RCs as I'll call them, is dependent on the potential risk to product quality. That's in consideration of those risk assessment activities through the approaches that we see in ICH Q9, considering the overall control strategy and any potential for concurrent changes, the potential impact then to product quality for implementing a specific change. So this slide contains a diagram from ICH Q12, which helps bring those previous two slides to life about how to identify established conditions and reporting categories and the steps along the way. This example is presented really from the perspective of process parameters, and I encourage everyone to go read ICH Q12 and to really see the preceding and concluding text around this diagram. There's very good context there. But I'll try to walk through this so you get a flavor and understanding of how the scientific knowledge and risk assessment approach can help streamline changes by identifying a smaller subset or even a lower reporting category for that subset of changes. And in the context of process parameters, we start with that first question of whether or not the process parameter has an impact on product quality. So does it need to be controlled to ensure product quality? For example, is it a CPP or critical process parameter, or a process parameter where the impact on quality cannot be excluded? And in the cases where the answer is no, where the scientific development work, the product and process knowledge can justify that this specific parameter does not have that kind of impact on product quality, we can immediately consider it not to be an established condition, and therefore changes can be managed solely by the pharmaceutical quality system and not reported to the application. So immediately cut out a big chunk of potential supplements by going through that upfront work to identify what's an established condition or not. Now, if we follow the yes side of this diagram, for those that are determined to be established conditions, we have further opportunity for flexibility when considering risk assessments when it comes to making changes or implementing that specific changes. And considering the total risk to quality in context of the entirety of the control strategy, what does that potential risk look like? And if the risk assessment comes out to be high, then we can expect those changes to be reported under prior approval supplements. If they're reported, or the risk comes out to be moderate or low, they can follow notification pathways, or in our terminology, CPEs or annual reports. So here we have another example from ICH Q12, which helps drive the point about how utilizing this tool can help reduce the amount of items that need to be reported, as well as the level of reporting, or the stringency of the reporting category. But this example now focuses from the type of development approach and the resultant product and process knowledge in comparison. And I won't belabor the point and go through every line item on here, but just to highlight some areas to note in these red boxes to help drive the idea that the more product and process knowledge that an applicant can build and the more scientific understanding they can bring to the table to justify and identify what is an established condition and what is the level of potential risk with implementing changes to that established condition. And as you work your way across these different development approaches, you can see the level of established conditions, or the number of established conditions reduces as well as the reporting categories associated with those established conditions also gets less stringent. So to help drive the idea that, whether we're going with a very minimal development approach with very minimal product and process knowledge, in the parameter-based approach, all the way over to performance-based approaches on the right-hand side of this diagram, we're expected to see much higher level of product and process knowledge, much more risk understanding, and much tighter connection to the impact of product quality or quality attributes. That along that spectrum, we can expect to see a reduction in the established condition and a reduction in the reporting categories associated with those established conditions. So hopefully what we've been able to see over the last couple of slides is the real-world impact of established conditions. And that by utilizing this tool to identify ECs and reporting categories, we're in a position to reduce the submission of unnecessary supplements and focus those changes that are reported to applications on those that are most critical to ensuring product quality. And even in those cases, find ways to reduce the stringency of that reporting category to expedite the implementation of those changes. So which ultimately results in more flexibility for the industry to implement changes slowly within the pharmaceutical quality system or at faster approaches through supplements, which ultimately gets greater ability to react quickly to supply chain challenges. For example, bringing on new facilities, bringing on changes to the manufacturing processes and controls, for example, to build capacity, maybe changing container closures. All these examples where identifying upfront what would require a supplement and at what level versus what can be done solely within the PQS brings more predictability and more clarity to react more quickly, ultimately enabling more effective and more proactive post-approval lifecycle management strategies. Now, another tool that's discussed in ICH Q12 is the Post-Approval Change Management Protocol, or PACMP. As I mentioned earlier, in the FDA system, these are known as comparability protocols, or CPs. I may be using those terms interchangeably during this section of the presentation. But what it is a regulatory tool that provides predictability, transparency, and alignment in terms of the requirements and studies needed to implement a change. So you can imagine in situations where you needed to make a change such as a new source or a change to a manufacturing process, that there's a lot of utility and value in predefining the data needed to support that change, the acceptance criteria, and what would be considered successful versus unsuccessful, so that when it came time to actually implement the change, it could be done so with a lot more predictability, a lot more transparency, and ultimately a lot lower risk in implementing that change because of all the upfront alignment and awareness between both the industry and the regulator. So not only does it get you that predictability, but it also provides for the opportunity for lowering the reporting category when ultimately implementing that change, should that change, when implemented, meet all those success criteria, acceptance criteria with the studies previously outlined. So overall, it's providing a great opportunity for proactive planning and risk mitigation. Now, something interesting about PACMPs is the variety of ways that they can be utilized and implemented across products. Now, in contrast to established conditions, which are really defined in the context of one application product based on the development knowledge and product process awareness for that product, PACMPs have a variety of different implementation approaches. Now, they can be used in the context of one product, so one or more changes to a single product. However, PACMPs could also focus on CMC changes that are shared across multiple products. So, for example, defining a strategy to change a stopper across multiple products that use the same container closure system and where the risks and product interaction between the formulation and the stopper are shared. So you can imagine a situation where you can develop a PACMP or a protocol to change that one stopper using the same study, the same data generation, assuming all the CMC quality risks are shared across all those products with that CCS. Another way that the PACMP can be used is by implementing one or more changes across multiple products and multiple sites. So, for example, changing analytical methods across multiple manufacturing sites or changing the sites themselves. A while ago, we had a comparability protocol come in that talked about strategies for moving drug substance manufacturing operations to any number of drug substance manufacturing facilities pre-specified in that comparability protocol. And with that awareness, being able to identify differences in manufacturing approaches and accounting for that in these studies and the way of assessing the change in order to lower the risk and lower the reporting category of the eventual change if they were to move to a different facility. So a lot of different flavors in how a PACMP or comparability protocol can be used, which gives a lot of advantages in situations such as what we're dealing with in the pandemic, where components can be shared across multiple products, where facilities can be impacting multiple products, where certain changes might need to be repeated over time to accommodate changes in the supply chain or the dynamic nature of constraints along the supply chain. The comparability protocol, by allowing upfront alignment on the plan and the approach to making a change, decoupling that from the actual implementation and execution of a change, and the ability to apply it flexibly within a product or across multiple products or multiple sites, really has a nice supply chain advantage when you think about its applicability and its utility. So let's break down the impact even further as far as looking at the benefit of using a comparability protocol or a PACMP. Now, a question can easily be asked, why not just do a prior approval supplement? If you need to make a change, just commingle the steps of identifying what data you would need, identifying the acceptance criteria, identifying the study plan and study approach, what we'll call step one, and commingle that with the execution of the change. So implementing the change, generating the data, and being able to show that you were successful, and then submitting that to the regulator for approval. So the step two there. Why not commingle that and just do one prior approval supplement in the FDA system, 4-month clock? What's the big deal? When we think about the advantage and think about it pictorially, so on the right side of the screen here, you can think about a situation where through a prior approval supplement, you can get the upfront alignment in step one of the data needs, the acceptance criteria, the study approach, et cetera. And if approved, have that ready to go at a moment's notice when you need to make a change to then implement it at a lower reporting category. So in contrast to submitting a PAS every single time you need to make a change, especially in the situation we're dealing with now with the dynamic changes across supply chain, the dynamic need to vigilantly make changes potentially repeatedly. For example, let's take into example container closure systems, where supplies are being constrained. You might change from one glass vial to a comparable glass vial from another supplier. You might have to do that again and again and again over the course of this pandemic, given the dynamic availability of supplies. So rather than submitting a PAS every single time for that, imagine a scenario where now you can do the actual execution of that change at a lower reporting category in this red box here, the step two change, because all the step one work was already completed and approved and aligned upon, such that the execution and implementation of the change itself can now happen repeatedly when needed at that streamlined implementation approach. So hopefully what you can see here is that this is proactive risk management and the ability to put yourself in a position to react much faster given low reporting category and the upfront alignment and predictability of change implementation. So here we have some recent examples of comparability protocols that we have reviewed in the FDA. And there's a different flavor across all three of these examples here. But just to give you an idea of the spectrum, in one case we were dealing with switching from single-use mixing bags to stainless steel tanks because of concerns that bag supply for these single-use systems could be critically constrained during the pandemic. So preparing up front for the possibility of needing to switch equipment. In the second example, relocating multiple filling lines to a new proposed manufacturing facility. Because of the severity of that change, getting upfront awareness and alignment of what it would take to do that before jumping into it, given that once that change is made, if it were not approved, there could be some serious disruptions to the supply as a result. And a third example, an approach to implementing an alternate bioburden reduction filter, container closure system, and freeze-thaw equipment for drug substance manufacturing processes due to supply constraints. So a lot of complex changes in one approach there. When you think about kind of what these flavors represent, in the first one, we're talking about a broader prospective strategy. Again, in case these supplies get constrained, let's get the plan in place now so that we can react very quickly. In the second example, prospective planning for a specific known change. So again, the applicant knew exactly what they wanted to do and when they wanted to do it, but wanted to mitigate risk as much as possible prior to executing that change so that there was potential minimal disruption if there were any problems or unforeseen issues with the review and action on the application. And finally, the last change, planning for concurrent changes, where we see a multitude of changes going on here. So how can we approach an angle of doing this all at once with the appropriate studies to back it up? So both ICHQ-12 tools that we have talked about, established conditions and associated reporting categories, as well as these post-approval change management protocols or comparability protocols, both provide a platform for risk management and the upfront preparation and flexibility for change implementation, albeit through different pathways. They're getting us to the same place, with established conditions allowing applicants to prospectively identify across the application what changes would require supplement versus those that would not, with PACMPs or comparability protocols, whether it's a specific change or potential broader changes, allowing an applicant to identify up front how they would go about approaching that change and ensuring success, as well as lowering the reporting category in some cases and making that change that much more streamlined and faster towards implementation. So both of these tools are getting us something very important when it comes to the supply chain constraints that we're dealing with now, in that we get faster reaction to the stimuli for change, whether that's capacity limitations or supply chain situations that we're seeing across the board. So another tool that's available, this is not a part of ICHQ-12, but it's more FDA-centric. One of our policies and procedures is the use of grouped product quality supplements, or if you're dealing with a biologic license application, what we call it trans-BLA. Now again, just as I mentioned for all these other guidance documents, this specific policy and procedure, you'll have a link to it on your resources slide to get a little more information about what this is and how it can be used. But essentially what it does is, instead of submitting a individual supplement for individual application products, when that same change is shared across a family of products, allowing the applicant to submit one change, one supplement that applies to all those products for that much more efficiency in submission, action, and implementation across products at one time. So, for example, I'll go back to my example of container closure systems. If you had 10 products sharing the same glass vial and same stopper, with similar formulation characteristics, similar manufacturing operations, similar risk, overall CMC risk, instead of submitting 10 supplements, if you needed to make a change to the container closure system and waiting for 10 actions and 10 reviews, a pathway to submit one supplement with shared data, shared outcomes that applies to all 10 of those products, and with one action and one approval, be able to implement that that change across that entire family at one time, rather than waiting for 10 individual actions. So here are some recent examples of grouped product quality supplements. In the first example here, we had a situation where we were able to utilize one single submission and supplement to change the release and stability testing laboratory for multiple products that were utilizing a single laboratory, able to move them en masse, or the facility doing the testing en masse, to a new facility, and be able to increase capacity of testing and release and distribution of products as a result. The second example I previously mentioned, as far as changing glass vials because of supply constraints for an existing glass vial, again, it was a situation where the conditions were right, and that multiple products were utilizing the same container closure system, the same glass vial, had similar CMC characteristics, so we were able to commingle everything onto one supplement and one change, rather than individual supplements. And hopefully it's self-evident by thinking about how this can play out from a regulatory affairs and approval strategy standpoint, just how much more efficient it can be from submitting, pursuing, and actually implementing changes utilizing this tool. So furthering this discussion on glass vials and stoppers, I want to change gears here and talk about a specific guidance that was published early on in the pandemic in relation to the supply constraints around glass vials and stoppers. As I mentioned earlier, one of the goals of our manufacturing supply chain initiative was to be vigilant and aware of constraints that might be propagating across multiple manufacturers and become a shared industry problem. And one of the things that popped up earlier on was concerns around the availability of glass vials and stoppers when we think about the increased production for therapeutics or even vaccines,
given that these components would be shared across all those products. It might put strain on the supply chain for the totality of products that require glass vials and stoppers. And very early on in the pandemic, we started to see multiple inquiries from component suppliers, so the manufacturers, the suppliers, and stoppers themselves, as well as sponsors regarding FDA's expectations for CMC changes. So what changes could be made, if they were made, what kinds of reporting categories of data would be needed to support that change. And it's very much a broad spectrum question, not so much about one specific product at a time, but more about the entire playing field here. I mentioned that there was concerns that the vaccine production and increased manufacturing therapeutics could further strain these supply chains. As well, we had proactive engagement between FDA and suppliers regarding supply status because of this concern. So reaching out to manufacturers, whether it was for the component or the applicants themselves, the drug manufacturers themselves, we inquired about supply status, shipments, whether or not there was anything precarious in the availability or procurement of these materials or these components. And by and large, putting everything on the table, it was determined that it would be important to issue a COVID-19 guidance on making changes to clean air closure systems, specifically glass vials and stoppers. And I want to make sure that you guys are aware of this. Again, you'll have a link to this specific guidance on your resources slide, as this is something that could persist during the pandemic, as far as the availability of these components that are shared across multiple products, whether they are a vaccine, a COVID-19 therapeutic, essential medicine that might be used in the ICU setting, to any product that's filled in a glass vial and uses a stopper for its CCS. So this guidance, again, was been published to facilitate the rapid implementation of CCS changes for critical drugs and biologic products, and it's very much taken from the perspective of enabling changes during the pandemic. And the actions, or what's contained in this guidance, is to clarify existing CMC expectations across multiple product types. So we talk about ANDAs and NDAs. We talk about biologic license applications that are regulated by CDER, as well as those that are regulated by CBER, since a lot of the expectations are shared. We also clarify the existing regulatory tools for streamlined change implementation. So linking back to a lot of the tools I had already discussed, for example, comparability protocols, and applying other streamlined change implementation approaches introduced through related COVID-19 guidance documents. And what I mean there is, in our COVID-19 guidance on glass vials and stoppers, we reference back to the manufacturing, supply chain, and inspection Q&A, and really link back to the idea of risk-based changes to reporting categories based on the totality of product and process knowledge and risk mitigation approaches that the applicant can pursue. So within the guidance, the core of the content is really focused on 3 change topics that, through our own internal assessment and engagement with applicants and manufacturers, were rising to the top as the most pressing areas of concern. And that was if we needed to make changes to the properties of the glass vials and stoppers, if we needed to change the source or site of manufacturing, or if we needed to change the manufacturing or processing conditions for glass vials and stoppers. And each one of these areas, the guidance document has a table which talks about the type of change we're talking about, the existing guidance from the change reporting category expectation, as well as the data needed to support that change, as well as opportunities where current practices and current scientific understanding, areas where we could find potential to reduce the reporting category or change the reporting category based on, again, the totality of scientific knowledge and risk mitigation approaches. And because this was a pretty big guidance or a pretty big topic spanning 2 centers and multiple product types, the tabular format was chosen for clarity and the ability to compare across product types. Now, this is an excerpt from the guidance itself. This is one of 6 tables, or an excerpt from one of 6 tables. But just to give you a flavor of the format and how it's laid out, again, the proposed change, the information to support that change, all the way through specific considerations to the reporting category where there may be opportunities to modify it based on the specific circumstances of the change. And this information is repeated again, it's repeated across all those different change areas for NDAs, ANDAs, and BLAs. So it's all in one spot. So a manufacturer, an applicant, if you are working across these different product types and application types and centers, it's all at your fingertips in one guidance document. And hopefully so similar to what we saw with glass vials and stoppers, FDA is seeing an emerging supply constraint when it comes to filters used in the manufacturing process. And this can be anywhere from sterilizing filters used in drug product operations all the way up to ultrafiltration, diafiltration filters used in drug substance manufacturing operations. And we're seeing a similar pattern in that we're getting multiple inquiries from manufacturers regarding the change expectations related to filters, whether that's changing suppliers, changing the material, changing the control strategy, for example, moving away from redundant filters and relying on a smaller set of filters in the manufacturing operation, even validating cycles for reuse of filters that were originally planned just for single use. Now, just as mentioned in the guidance, where we had a linkage between applicants dealing with supply situations and needing feedback, the opportunity to reach out to CDER OPQ inquiries at fda.hhs.gov. Same situation here. If anyone is dealing with filter concerns, please feel free to reach out to us. We are currently working with applicants to provide feedback on strategies for changing implementation and supplement requirements, and are available to help more. So, in conclusion, what we've seen throughout this presentation is that the supply chain vulnerability presents a real and present risk to the consistent supply of high-quality drugs. And we're seeing it exist at multiple levels, whether it's at multiple types of manufacturers along the pharma manufacturing supply chain, or even those levels that provide commodities, equipment, components, or services to that manufacturing supply chain. The vulnerabilities and constraints are being felt at all levels, which ultimately come back to whether or not we can provide consistent supply of high-quality drugs that are incredibly necessary during this pandemic. Again, it's felt across multiple product types. In some cases, we could be seeing shared concerns or shared constraints that apply to ANDAs, NDAs, BLAs, and products of all types. For example, what we saw in glass vials and stoppers, what we saw or we're seeing with filters. But what we also have at our disposal and our fingertips is that the idea of risk management activities can be beneficial, and they do extend to change management activities too. And there are multiple tools to help us implement proactive risk mitigation measures, multiple tools to help us efficiently implement these changes. And all of them, assuming that we are utilizing strong product and process knowledge and have mature pharmaceutical quality systems implemented and up and running, that these tools become that much more feasible, that much more attainable and usable. So in addition to the strong scientific product and process knowledge, as well as strong pharmaceutical quality systems that were essential for those tools that we have talked about to become usable, feasible, and attainable for applicants in managing and mitigating the risks of supply chain constraints to product supply, another critical element was early engagement with the FDA. I cannot stress enough how important and vital it is for success in order to proactively provide feedback and design strategies rather than reactively try to respond to an imminent threat or a current threat. Now, in our manufacturing supply chain and inspection Q&A, there are a bunch of different contexts depending on the type of product or center regulating that product, as well as situations where we are either in or entering drug shortage. I've summarized these contexts here so you have easy access to them, but I encourage you to read the guidance, the manufacturing supply chain inspection guidance, for a full picture around the appropriate utilization of these contact points. And in summary, I think it goes without saying how challenging the situation is really underscores the shared responsibility between FDA and the industry in maintaining the supply of high-quality drugs and patients. Not only the scientific knowledge, the risk mitigation approaches, the pharmaceutical quality system requirements, and the maturity of those systems on the industry side, but also on the FDA side, to be receptive to proposals, to be facilitative in providing feedback, and also be looking for ways and tools to be able to provide changes or implement changes much more quickly, much more flexibly, and much more common sense approaches. So between the two, quite a shared responsibility to ensure that we continue to maintain supply of high quality drugs for our patients. And with that, I will conclude my talk and leave you with the resources slides that I have talked about throughout the presentation. Over the talk, I mentioned quite a few guidance documents, policy and procedure documents, and the link to each one of those is provided for you here across these two slides. So for further questions, I highly encourage you to click on these links and see the source material and see how it all comes together. Now, in addition to all the guidance documents and policy documents that I talked about, there are two additional items on this last slide that we did not talk about in detail during the presentation, but nevertheless, I would like to highlight them so you have them at your fingertips. The first is our resiliency roadmap on FDA inspection oversight. I highly encourage you to click on that link and read that document, as it provides the roadmap for FDA's approach to inspections during the pandemic, given the dynamic nature of constraints even on our staff, whether it's travel restrictions, the safety of our investigators, et cetera. This document really provides a good overview of our plan for implementing and resuming inspections. And finally, the last resource that I did not discuss in detail, but nevertheless is available for those applicants that are in development of products for COVID-19, is our CDER Next Gen portal, specifically focused on manufacturing capacity. And through that portal, there's an opportunity to engage with FDA to help navigate capacity questions and ensure that we'll be able to have enough supply of a particular medication along its pathway for development into ideally distribution to patients. So with that, I will conclude my talk, and we'll look forward to the question and answer session. And again, thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you for the great presentation. We'll now transition into our second Q&A session. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Joining Commander Ramanadham on the Q&A panel, we welcome Hasmukh Patel, Director for the Division of Post-Market Activities 1, Office of Lifecycle Drug Product Assessment, OPQ, CDER. Looks like we have some questions coming in right now, and the first group of questions will be directed to Commander Ramanadham. And here's the first question. What is the response time if we communicate a case situation to the CDER OPQ mailbox?
Thank you for that question. So our response time may vary depending on the complexity of the question that we get. You can imagine that we might need to involve multiple groups across the center to evaluate the specifics of the question and ensure that we're giving the right feedback. But our goal is to ensure that we're responding as quickly as we possibly can, considering that the intent here is to receive questions and facilitate feedback on products or situations related to the COVID-19 response. So our goal is to do this as soon as we possibly can. If for any reason, a question was sent to the box and it's still pending a response, it's not a bad idea to check in with CDER OPQ inquiries to see if there's any updates. Certainly there's a lot of things moving through that. So I will leave it there and turn it back to Ray.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Commander Ramanadham. And here's the question. If a change to an EC and a DMF needs to be made, could this same process be followed?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, actually, especially when we consider the specific tools around ICHQ-12 or established conditions. It's a little different in the sense that, and this is a little more elaborated in our FDA implementation guidance for established conditions, or ICHQ-12, excuse me, and that the established conditions themselves will live with the application application, either submitted through the original application or submitted through a prior approval supplement to identify those established conditions. However, in the cases of established conditions identified for the drug substance, that supporting information, rationale, and justification and details may live in the DMF itself. So the thing that becomes a little different is that there must be close collaboration between the application holder and the DMF holder to ensure that we have access to the right supporting information, that any changes made, for example, talking about a DMF or drug substance, anything made at the drug substance manufacturing operations are appropriately shared and reflected in the established conditions of the application. So highlighting that linkage that needs to happen between the DMF holder and the application holder. So the principles and concepts apply, but the mechanisms are a little bit different, reflecting those roles and responsibilities for who owns applications and where the ECs live versus reference submissions like DMFs. Thank you for that.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Commander Ramanadham. Would the submission of a PC and a PAS for a new aseptic manufacturing facility result in a lower reporting category, or will an FDA PAI still be required?
Thank you for that question. I'm sure you all heard this many times before, but it depends. When it comes to impacted facilities, there are certain situations where a comparability protocol submitted that includes a change to the facility, either the operations or the introduction of a site new to the application. Certain situations where the reporting category could be reduced, there are definitely limitations to that given our need to confirm the compliance status and the acceptability of that facility relative to the operations proposed in that change. So there's certain limitations on how far that can be reduced. But it depends. When I say it depends, it means those risk factors as well as what do we know about the site. I would say in general, when a site has no FDA inspection history, that's trending towards a situation where the resultant submission, what I'll call the step 2 submission, would likely be higher. So likely be at a prior approval supplement. What has been valuable during this pandemic time, though, is greater utilization of alternate tools and resources. For example, leveraging information from foreign regulatory partners like the European Union and information gained from mutual recognition. Now, the thing is, I cannot stress enough, it depends on what type of operation we're looking at, what type of facility, what we know about the site, and putting that all into a risk assessment of how it can impact the subsequent submission for implementing the change. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question in this round, and this question is for Commander Ramanadham. And here's the question. You mentioned under the CARES Act redundancy risk management plans. What are the expectations for when these will be in place and reviewed upon inspection?
Thank you for that question. So the concept or the idea around the redundancy risk management plans is, again, newly formed under the CARES Act. The only thing I can really say about this is that FDA plans to publish guidance on the implementation and expectations around it. So for attendees to keep your eyes out for forthcoming guidance from the agency on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. The next few questions will be directed to Dr. Hasmukh Patel, and here is the first question. Should a comparability protocol describe the ECs, and should the comparability protocol include the actual study protocols such as data collection forms, etc., to be executed during the qualification of the change?
This Hasmukh Patel. Thank you for the question. For a comparability protocol, You do need to include what kind of studies you are going to perform, what would be the acceptance criteria, and any other studies you are going to perform. Now, in the case of established conditions, a comparability protocol is nothing but post-approval change management protocol. And so information to be submitted for comparability protocol for ECs would be similar to what you submit for any other change in a comparability protocol. But I think if you have established conditions and if you want to make a change in established conditions post-approval, then I would suggest that you submit post-approval change management protocol as per ICHQ 12 and refer to both ICHQ 12 guidance as well as comparability protocol guidance for further information. It provides recommendations on what kind of data you would have to submit, also what kind of test and whether you need to perform any additional test to submit the proposed change. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Dr. Patel, and here's the following question. When PACMP is used across multiple products, to what NDA should it be filed? Should it be filed to all impacted NDAs?
Now, this is another good question. When you file a PACMP, then you have to decide for which NDA you want to submit this protocol. And as Commander Ramanadham said in his presentation, that you, whichever NDA you identify, you provide all information that in that NDA and list all other NDAs for which you are planning to submit this PACMP. So it is similar to comparability protocol, and also Commander Ramanathan talked about group supplements. So this is what it is, a group supplements. And in addition to that, also you have to send supplement to all other NDAs listed in the lead supplement to which you are going to submit an PACMP. But in that one, other supplements, you just refer to the lead supplement where you have all information about PACMP. So you have to make a determination for which NDA you want to make that change first, and then for other supplements later on. Or at the same time you want to make changes. It is up to you to decide for which NDA you want to submit PACMP and list all other NDAs. Hope that.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Dr. Patel, and it's the following. Could you please touch base on the comparability protocol if this is required for pre-approval? How should these be designed, and is there a guidance document that covers this?
Implement, and that is covered in our comparability protocol guidance. Once in the comparability protocol in a prior approval supplement, as Commander Ramanathan talked about in his presentation, that you can reduce filing category for implementation of the protocol later on. But first, comparability protocol is a prior approval supplement. Also, you can submit comparability protocol in the original NDA or ANDA. I hope.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Patel, and here's the question. If a glass vial is used in 10 products, they're similar but not identical, do you need to test all 10 products with the new glass vial to confirm that the change does not impact the quality of the 10 products? Or can you test one representative product and provide the justification for the change?
Come across this kind of situation where a glass vial or elastomeric stopper company plan to use for multiple products like 50, 60 products. Now, in this case, glass vial is particularly for injectable products. And so if you have 10 products, then you have to look at how close the formulation of all 10 products are, whether there are any significant differences in the characteristics of the formulation, which may impact suitability of the vial for that product. And depending on that, whether you need to separate, you have to do some additional studies to qualify that vial for the product. So you may have to do some studies, for example, extractable leachables. So if all 10 products are very similar in the formulation, then you don't have to do studies for all 10. But pick one worst case product among those 10 and provide supportive data in the submission and group those all 10 products in one supplement. And then follow the group supplements requirements and submit accordingly. Is that answer the question?
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We'll now go back to Commander Ramanadham for a few more questions. And here's the next question. How do you see the approach of risk management aligning with continuous improvement for manufacturers in the pharmaceutical industry? Do you see a proactive risk management and continuous improvement to be one and the same?
Thank you for that question. And I think one that exemplifies the real underlying message of this session or this presentation. So to whoever asked that question, excellent question. So I think this is probably one that I'll start with, and definitely, Hasmukh might have some interesting perspectives on this as well. But from my perspective, yeah, I see them as highly interrelated. And the idea that by pursuing continuous improvement and pursuing areas where processes or controls or facility operations, you name it, can get better and better with the application of scientific knowledge, with the application of good manufacturing practices, and being vigilant for making improvements, we are inherently doing risk management. We are inherently designing out, or rather designing in quality as the product matures over its life cycle. And that can be applied to, again, the manufacturing operations, applied to the submission strategies, applied to product quality and their attributes and the way we test them. The idea of always developing and continually improving the product and the operations around that product, in my eyes, are very highly aligned to risk management, because it allows us, especially in the context of principles like ICHQ 12, it allows us to use that knowledge and focus in on smaller and smaller sets of information or items that need regulatory oversight, and thereby enables companies to be that much more flexible, much more agile, and that much more quick in reacting to stimuli for change, reacting to externalities that are affecting the manufacturing and delivery of medications. I know I was a little long-winded about that, but I think it was an excellent question. It really exemplifies what we're trying to convey through the utilization of these tools and how they link back to risk management approaches. So I'll pause there and open it up to Hasmukh if he has additional thoughts to add there.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think continuous improvement is very important throughout the life cycle of the product. One example I can give is a continuous manufacturing. Now we have many products approved many years back using batch process, and now many companies are going for continuous manufacturing. That is that will help us in a risk management, right? Also to you that continuous manufacturing is very effective, also provides a really quality product, and also in an efficient manner. At the same time, reducing risk to some extent. So I think both are aligned quite well, and we encourage companies to continue improving their processes, product, and even quality over time. Mahesh?
Couldn't agree more, Osmuk.
Thank our panel for responding to that last question. And our next question will be directed to Commander Ramanadham. And here is the next question. The COVID-related supply chain constraints are impacting approved products as well as products pending approval under a marketing application to FDA. Will the CCS and filter change strategies that FDA has worked with approved product manufacturers also be allowed to those manufacturers of products pending approval?
Thank you for the question. Excellent question there. In the context of the CCS guidance that went out outlining approaches to submitting and making changes post-approval, though the guidance itself was focused on the post-approval stage of the life cycle, I think it's fair to say that the principles when it comes to the scientific data needs, approaches to switching and engagement with the industry apply to products pending approval as well. And in the guidance document on the first page, we have a footnote that reiterates this concept. So footnote number 1 talks about the application of these principles to original applications pending approval. Now, the difference here being that when products are pending approval or going through the development approach, what we encourage is that applicants dealing with these situations talk directly with the review teams that they're working with to discuss the impact of any of these constraints, the changes that might be needed, and what impact that might make to the development program or the CMC section, whether it's the IND or the application itself. Sorry, the original application itself. Thank you for that.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Commander Ramanadham, and here's the question. Should ECs be defined in dossiers, even if they are ones that FDA typically considers if the approach towards suggesting a lower filing category will still be utilized?
Yeah, that's a good complex question there. So first and foremost, I invite audience members to access the links and check out FDA's implementation consideration guidance for ICHQ 12 as it applies to CDER regulated products, or FDA regulated products, excuse me. In there, we talk about different ways that the applicant should identify how they're going to be utilizing established conditions, whether that's talking up front about not proposing specific established conditions and reporting categories, rather relying on regional regulation and guidance. That is an option. There's nothing that requires applicants to pursue specific established conditions further specified beyond those afforded in regional regulation and guidance, or in our U.S. regulation and guidance, all the way down to identifying those specific elements in the product lifecycle management document. Now, we wanted to make it as common sense and burden-free as possible. So definitely look at that guidance document because it provides the pathway for how applicants should notify the FDA in the cover letter and in sections of 3.2R, the ECTD, about specific statements and specific approaches in utilizing ICHQ-12 principles. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for both of our panelists, and what we'll do is we'll ask Commander Ramanadham first and then allow him to go on mute and then pass over to Dr. Patel. And here's the question. Are these tools to be used only during the pandemic situation, or can these tools be used from now on?
Excellent question there. So it's a mix as far as the things that I had included in my presentation. And the resources slide will be very helpful for this when you go and click on all the links and sort of look at the documents. Those that are coming from COVID-19 guidances are very much within the confines of the public health emergency. That's not to say that some of the concepts and principles might not be valuable or evaluated by FDA for further propagation beyond the pandemic, but anything in a COVID-19 guidance really is for the boundaries of the current public health emergency. However, other tools, for example, comparability protocols, ICHQ-12, group product quality supplements, those are, what I would call normal FDA guidances or policies now and are applicable across product types, regardless of their urgency, and not time-bound by the COVID-19 public health emergency. So going back specifically to those can be used from now on. And I'll pause there and open it up to Hasmukh.
Yeah, Mahesh, you have covered quite well. ICHQ-12, post-approval change guidances, comparability protocol, they are applicable even without the pandemic. So I think the concepts and principles in the COVID-19 related guidances are applicable only during the pandemic. I mean, not only pandemic, but also applicable outside of pandemic. Mahesh?
Thank you, Hasmukh. Very well said.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Commander Ramanadham, for your very informative and timely talk, and for both of our panelists for responding to numerous questions that came in. Moving into our